Thank you all very much. You might be wondering, amid all the excitement and all the things we've been talking about over this weekend, Trump and the border and China and the economy, suddenly there's this talk about jihad. Who let this guy in from 2004? How did this come to be an issue nowadays when nobody's thinking about it? So I wanted to alert you to the fact that, unfortunately, it has not gone away, and we are in the paradoxical position now of having more jihad, more open about being jihad all around the world today, and less discussion of what it is and why this is all happening than ever. And so even though there is so much more of it, nobody seems to be aware or interested in that fact, except the jihadis who are still at it. And so, for example, I have, this was just November 8th, so that was a couple of weeks ago, a sheikh from Iraq, Yusuf al-Nasiri, he spoke on Russia Today television. And he said, "Our war in Palestine is not just a Palestinian Zionist war, it is a global war." Now, that seems to me to be a perfectly clear statement, because the war in Israel is indeed a global war, as the only reason why there has never been peace, the only reason why every negotiated settlement fails, is because of the jihad principle that any land that has ever belonged to Islam, has ever been governed by Islamic law, belongs to Islam forever. The Quran says, drive them out from where they drove you out. And so if the land was ruled by Islam and it is no longer, then the Muslims have a responsibility before Allah, as strong as the 10 Commandments for Jews and Christians, to drive out those who now govern the land. So the war against Israel is a classic jihad, and that's really all that it is. Paradoxically, if you read the statements out of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, even the Palestinian Authority, which is reputed to be moderate, every last one of them frames the conflict in terms of jihad and Islam. And then if you read the State Department and the European Union and the United Nations, not a one of them ever in a single document considers for a second the implications of the fact that this is an Islamic jihad. And so, when this guy says, this is not a local conflict, this is a global war, what he means is, this is part of the jihad that is also being waged in every other place around the world. And yet this is the one statement, this simple statement that the Palestinian Zionist war, as he called it, is a global war, that would make no sense to anyone in the State Department today. They don't have any intellectual apparatus to understand what that statement even means or to grasp its implications, because they are dogmatically committed to the idea that Islam is peaceful, that jihad is this interior spiritual struggle, and that consequently, if there is rhetoric about jihad from, for example, the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or whoever, then that's just a rhetorical screen for the real problem, which is geographical or economic or some combination of both, such that if the Israelis just give back enough land and allow for a Palestinian state, then there will be peace. And this conflict has nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict in Afghanistan or the conflict in India with Kashmir, between India and Pakistan, or the genocide of Christians in Nigeria, or any of the other jihads around the world. But this guy and his colleagues, they understand very well what the implications are of the fact that the war in Israel is just one theater of a world war that is the Islamic Jihad, to fight until religion is all for Allah, as the Quran says. So the same sheikh, he said, for us it is all the same, whether Trump Harris or anyone else wins the elections, this was actually right after the election, but that's what he said, there's no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. When it comes to foreign policy, they are all the same. The only difference is that Trump is not a hypocrite. Trump is a manifest infidel. Now, what does that mean? See, these statements are all very important and they're full of implications. He's saying Harris was a hypocrite. What's a hypocrite? That you say one thing, but you really believe something different. This is a very important category in Islam. If you read the Quran, it's full of castigations of the hypocrites, people who say they're on your side, but they're not really. This is a very important theological concept. It's not tangential or incidental. And what he's saying is that the left pretends to be on our side, but they're not. Trump, he's obviously not on our side. He's a manifest infidel. And notice the infidel term, that he's putting this once again in the language of a religious conflict. His problem with Trump is that Trump is not a Muslim. His problem with Harris is that she pretends to be friendly on his side, but she's not really. She doesn't really mean it. Now, this is, in fact, a reflection of the larger Leftist Islamic alliance, which I've discussed many times in this same venue over the years. Some of you may recall that we've discussed how the left loves Islam because when you're talking about socialist internationalists, they are authoritarian and they hate nation states because obviously if you've got an internationalist program, then you want to go to war against the world's foremost nation state, which is the United States. So say if you got socialist internationalist saboteurs and one of them becomes president of the United States, one thing he might do would be erase the southern border and let in millions of people. And so then you dilute the national character, you destroy the national culture, and you set up a voting base for yourself forever with all the welfare cases that you've brought in, and you destroy the world's foremost nation state in the service of your internationalist agenda. The internationalist agenda is authoritarian. They want to establish not a global democracy, as they constantly speak about, but actually the Biden regime, as we saw many times, made many moves against the freedom of speech. They tried to set up the Disinformation Governance Board and they got shot down, but they worked with the social media giants to stifle dissent and deplatform dissenters. They did a number of other things to show that they are no friends of a free society. In Islam, there is a hadith, a report about Muhammad's words, where he says that obey your ruler even if he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. Now, people quote that to say, look what a racist Muhammad was, and that's a perfectly reasonable point. But I think the more important point is that he's an authoritarian. He's saying, obey the ruler no matter what. That's music to the left's ears. Because they want to inculcate that kind of blind obedience to their agenda and the criminalization of dissent. That's why they had trumped up, so to speak, all those charges against the president-elect. So you have this alliance between the left and Islam. The left has been encouraging Islam in the West, particularly in Europe, because they want to inculcate that kind of obedience to the authority and the internationalism of Islam. Islam says that your obedience, your allegiance to the global ummah trumps all other allegiances, overrides your national allegiance, your ethnic allegiance, anything else. And so the left loves Islam. At the same time, Islam is not so happy with the alliance. It'll use it, but they don't like the embrace of sexual deviance, madness, delusion, men thinking they're women. And so it's a shaky alliance. And so he says, Harris is a hypocrite, Trump is not. Then he says, the US dollar and the American economy must be destroyed. Now you might wonder, why would an Iraqi sheikh who is talking about Israel say the US dollar and the American economy must be destroyed? Because here, once again, he is thinking of this as a global struggle, not as a local one. And yet, Every authority, every analyst who is making policy in Washington thinks of the Israel-Palestinian conflict as a local struggle with no international implications beyond Middle East relations. They don't even stop to think, wait a minute, Iran hates Israel, but why does Iran hate Israel? Israel has no territorial claims over Iran. Israel never threatened Iran. Israel has no economic competition with Iran. What on earth makes Iran hate Israel? It's Islamic Jihad. That's the only reason. If Iran were not an Islamic republic, then Iran and Israel could be friends as they were in the time of the Shah. But because Islam teaches this, drive them out from where they drove you out, which is Quran, and thus there is no higher authority, then Iran has Israel as its foremost enemy. And so these things go completely by the foreign policy establishment, and yet these things are the key to the conflict. Now, there's another imam I wanted to quote for you, and that is Tariq Alan, who is at the Muslim American Society Staten Island Center in New York City. And on October 25th, he preached a Friday sermon, and he was talking about jihad. And he was saying that you don't have to wage armed jihad, but remember that there are immense blessings if you wish to, if you want to, and if you will take the opportunity when it comes to you to do so. And he said, you are living safely today here in America. Who is to say that your situation will not change in the next 10 years? That you will not be living in a circumstance or situation where jihad will apply to you? And think about what we've seen over the last few years. That we've known that the left controls the college campuses for decades. And David and many others have spoken out against this, raised awareness about it. But now we're seeing it go to a new level with the encampments and with the increasing threats against Jewish and pro-Israel students on campuses. And now it's gone to an even more threatening and dangerous level. We have open support for Hamas expressed freely on college campuses. Remember that Hamas is still a designated terrorist group by the U.S. State Department. We have at Concordia University in Canada, just yesterday, we had people doing the Hitler salute and calling for a final solution. And so the real problem here is that the university administrators don't really do anything about this, except for a few token gestures here and there, because of course they're largely sympathetic to this point of view, and because they're afraid. And so we're already seeing the step that is the step right before active violence on college campuses and elsewhere. We saw a pro-Hamas mob march through a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn just the other day. This also, it's a very clear threat. Why can't they march anywhere else? They want to frighten the people. They want to do actually what, here again, what the Quran says, strike terror in the enemies of Allah. How better to strike terror than to be marching through, you're in your house and having a peaceful evening and there are people outside screaming for your head. And I mean that quite literally, because they chant, Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews, the army of Muhammad will return, which is a reference to the Khaybar oasis in northern Arabia, where Muhammad carried out a surprise attack and a massacre of the Jews, according to Islamic tradition. And so when they say Khaybar, Khaybar, Ya Yahud, people don't understand. They think, oh, they're saying some Arabic thing, and it's an ancient chant. Yeah, sure, it's all those things. But Khaybar means we're going to come and massacre you. And so here again, the lack of knowledge about what we are dealing with is still hamstringing our ability to deal with it. Tariq Alam also said, the Prophet said that Allah will spread this matter of Islam to all the corners of the earth, and Allah will not leave a single house except for this religion will enter it. through honoring those who deserve honor through Islam, or humiliating those who deserve humiliation through disbelief. So Allah made this promise that this religion will reign supreme over all religions. This guy is speaking in Staten Island. Do you think there's any possibility that he might be responsible for some civil strife that we could very well see in Staten Island or its environs in the near future? And meanwhile, the UK and Spain and Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark and Sweden and other countries in the West have all recently imposed criminal proceedings, criminal proceedings against people who criticized Islam, because they say that it harms social cohesion. Now, the problem with that is that you can say, well, those people, they were all hateful, they were all bigoted, and they were going off half-cocked and saying crazy things. Well, that's not always the case. Unfortunately, the situation that we have is 20 years of indoctrination into the idea that any criticism of Islam is Islamophobic and bigoted and consequently should be shut down. So, for example, I had this guy write me the other day. He was a professor in Warren, Michigan. He's 82 years old. And he told me his story, that he's kind of a local historian there in Warren, Michigan, and he writes about what's happened, what the history of the city is. But he had been in the military, he had studied Islam, and so he wrote some things on his Facebook 10 years ago that were critical of Islam. And so recently, the mayor of Warren, Michigan, Lori Stone, she appointed him, this kindly old man, to the city's historic commission. It's what could be more harmless and innocuous than being on the historic commission in Warren, Michigan? Who could possibly object? Well, somebody dug up his Facebook quotes from 10 years ago that were critical of Islam and initiated a recall petition to take Mayor Lori Stone out of office because she had appointed this man to the Historic Commission. And I could stand here and give you story after story of local officials all over the United States who have been forced to resign, forced to apologize because they said things that were absolutely true about Islam and jihad. And they were made to leave their positions under pressure because anything remotely negative regarding Islam is now forbidden. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we have the freedom of speech, but when it comes down to practice, there are many restrictions on it. And one of the foremost, we've been talking about cancel culture here this weekend and how it's receding, and that's all to the good. But one of the first victims of cancel culture were the people who were talking honestly about what Islam and jihad were all about. And that's been a total victory for the cancelers. They have been able to carry the day such that now people have internalized the idea that if you speak critically about Islam, then you have done something that is very, very far out of bounds, and you can no longer be in polite company. And this prevails among the right as well as the left. I was speaking out in California, and there was a candidate, this was last summer, there was a local candidate speaking before me, and he spoke to the crowd about how he had gone to Culver City to the King Fahd Mosque, which is a Saudi mosque that has numerous ties to terrorists. And he didn't say anything like that. He was just saying, it's very important that we make an outreach to the Muslim community. And I was the first Republican candidate to go speak at the King Fahd Mosque. And I think, this is a very difficult situation because, of course, these people are American citizens. and voters, and there are many people there who have nothing to do with jihad, will never wage jihad, and have no interest in jihad, and consequently, it's perfectly reasonable for him to want to go there. At the same time, if you bring up what the King Fahd Mosque's past has been, and if you bring up the difficulties that may be involved in not wanting to challenge that because you don't want to offend this possible source of voters, well then you see it becomes very difficult territory, and I think all too many on the right as well as the left have been altogether too willing to think, well, we can just embrace the moderates and everything will be okay, because the moderates, after all, are the vast majority. Well, see, here again, it's very important to have a precise understanding of what we're dealing with. There are many Muslims, and indeed the majority, who are never going to blow anything up. And that's very great. But when you're talking about Islamic teaching, there's no version of the Quran, there's no form of Islam that does not teach warfare against unbelievers and the necessity to, as I said, this is from the Quran, chapter 8, verse 39, fight until religion is all for Allah. Now that doesn't mean every Muslim is going to do it, but it does mean that it is present within Muslim communities that you have some who are working toward this, and they are going to be working in and among those who are not doing these things. And we need to have a steady and sober regard for the reality of the situation. But right now that has been completely obscured. Back in 2011, the Obama administration instituted what it called the Countering Violent Extremism program. And that very carefully removed all mention of Islam and jihad from counter-terror training. So that ever since then, the first Trump administration did not correct this. Ever since then, there has been no branch of the U.S. government, no U.S. government agency, nothing in the U.S. government that is studying Islam and jihad in order to understand what our foes are all about. Now, is that wise? Isn't the first rule of warfare to know your enemy? And yet the whole problem has been obscured by people saying, well, we'll offend our Muslim allies, we will offend the moderates. Well, I'll tell you, let's talk about moderates. There are about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and 9/11 happened, and many other jihad attacks have happened since then. Most notoriously, recently, October 7th happened. Where have you seen major Muslim organizations saying, this is terrible, we reject it, and we're fighting against it? Where have you seen marches, demonstrations? You see a person here, a person there, individuals who have very little following in the actual Islamic communities. And yet, it's tempting, and unfortunately, all too many of us have fallen prey to the temptation to put all our hope that these people are going to turn things around. Well, you can't turn around what's in the perfect book that was given from paradise to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. What it says goes. And unfortunately, there are still Muslims who are working toward that in the United States. So I hope, in conclusion, and it is a hope, that the incoming Trump administration will take a realistic look at this problem, which has been lacking in Washington since 2011 when Obama instituted the CVE program. And incidentally, think about that before that we had the war on terror. The war on terror is long over. And the war on terror didn't have anything to do with Islam either, but it was closely associated in the popular mind. The countering violent extremism was an explicit attempt to disassociate Islam from terrorism. But what's a violent extremist? Can you point one out to me? I know you can point at me. But the fact is, it's a nothing term. It doesn't mean anything. What's a violent extremist? It's whatever you want it to be, and that's the point. Who did the Biden administration make violent extremists? Yeah. And you think I'm kidding. They sent counter-terror people into Catholic churches to look for pro-lifers. They started terrorism investigations on angry parents protesting against critical race theory at school board meetings. Countering violent extremism is a terrific vehicle for authoritarians because you can turn it against anybody who you want to eliminate in pursuit of your authoritarian agenda. And so consequently, it's imperative, I think, for the Trump administration to revisit this, to end the CVE program once and for all, to speak realistically about Islam and jihad. And that means a comprehensive, realistic approach that takes into account the fact that there are many, many Muslims at different stages of fervor and knowledge in their faith. And so this is not demonizing an entire population or any of the rhetoric that the left has so successfully put over on us over the last 20 years. But rather, we have to deal with the fact that these Islamic teachings are endless wellsprings of recruitment for terrorism. And that's not going to change, particularly if we just keep ignoring it and pretending that it's not so. And so the state of jihad today in 2024 is that it is more upon us than ever, and we're not paying any attention to that fact. But we have hope because we do have an administration that will be full of people who are courageous in clinging to reality, saying men are men and women are women and one can't become the other, and so on. And so I hope also that that realism will carry over to this all-important field and that we will see a better approach in the coming 4 years. Thank you very much.
We actually have time. We have time for 2 questions before I introduce our last speaker before lunch. So I'm going to go Philip and then Mark. I'm sorry, they had their hands up before you two. I'm sorry. But we'll go with these 2. So Phil and then Mark's next.
Sure, simple question. The news reported that the Muslims in Michigan voted for Trump versus Kamala. Why?
Yeah, you know, they did because Trump said he was not going to get involved in wars and that he wanted Netanyahu to end the war before January 20th. And so the Muslims in Michigan were so angry with Biden and Harris for their ostensible support of Israel. And I say ostensible because, of course, we know this war wouldn't be happening if it weren't for Biden and Harris. They are funding Hamas and Hezbollah to wage war against Israel. They say they're allied with Israel, but then he sent $10 billion to Iran and $1 billion to Gaza. So we're funding both sides. It's insane. The Muslims in Michigan were very angry with it, quite rightly, and they said they would vote for Trump, and so apparently many of them did. Now I see that they're very angry, and they say all these pro-Israel appointees in the Trump cabinet, it's been a bait and switch. He fooled us. He lied to us. Now that, of course, we know is not the case. Trump was the most pro-Israel president in the history of modern Israel when he was president before, and he made no secret of his support for Israel. So there was no deception. There was no bait and switch. It seems as if they were hoping that they could manipulate him based on his determination to make peace, because peace, if you call for a ceasefire now, for example, without return of the hostages, then Hamas and Hezbollah survive. If the war goes on, they will both likely collapse. So they want the peace now, and they're hoping Trump will give it to them without the victory of Israel. That's unlikely.
Last question.
Do you see any hope for Western Europe, or is it going to be one Sharia state?
I think there's both, actually, that there will be Sharia in Western Europe, certainly, but there will also be areas where there are pockets of resistance and a lot of conflict, a lot of war in Europe coming. Unfortunately, I don't see any way around that now. They could have stopped this, as Mike was saying, they could have stopped this 20 years ago. They could have stopped it, they could have not started it in 1973 when it first started, when the Arab League made agreements with the European Commission, and the European Commission was given cheap oil in exchange for unrestricted Arab immigration without assimilation. And that's all. This is not a conspiracy theory. You read Batya Or's Eurabia, you'll see all the documents. And they brought this on themselves. And so now I don't know how they're going to get out of it without armed struggle. Thank you.